of Seed Trans Network to kick us off and to get started. Over to you, Anuj. Anuj, you're on mute.
Yep. Yeah, thanks so much, Mohan. Yeah, good evening and welcome to the STN India's Leadership Series talk with Vipul Parekh as he takes us through his exciting journey from being a startup to scaling BigBasket to a level where they have recently signed a $1.2 billion deal with the Tata Group. Thank you very much, Vipul, for being here with us today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So before we get into this talk, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction about the Seed Transformation Network. The network comprises of past participants from the year-long hands-on Seed Transformation program organized by Stanford. Designed specifically for business owners, the program is designed to develop the skills, tools, and mindset required to grow and scale businesses and positively impact the community. Led by Stanford GSB faculty, local experts, and supported by Stanford-trained facilitators, the program is offered in South Asia and Africa. The applications have just recently opened up for the next cohort, which starts in September 2021, and those interested may visit Stanford Seed's website to know more details. The objective of this alumni network is to be able to harness the power of the global seed community by connecting online, in person, and at events, and leveraging such connections to scale our businesses, thereby providing employment and opportunities to others in our countries. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us today for this webinar from Singapore, Africa, and I believe some from Europe as well, and of course, India. So welcome everybody, and thank you for being part of this leadership series. I would now like to hand over to Nirmala Sankaran, the director leading this leadership series initiative, as well as the incoming STN India president, to introduce our today's guest speaker, Vipul Parekh. Over to you, Nimi.
Thank you so much, Anuj. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So Vipul Parekh is a classmate and a very dear friend of mine from my IIM days. I don't remember any experiences at all from the classroom because I think after the first term, we rarely attended lectures. But I vividly remember that he was always game to go on treks and many random trips outside of the campus and sometimes outside Bangalore also. Apparently, he passed the final exams because he has the ability to memorize a complete textbook. So when we graduated from IIM, no one in our batch, and definitely not him, could have imagined in the wildest of our dreams that Vipul would one day make a living selling fruits and vegetables and provisions. And that too to 5 million people. But today he let out a secret that made me realize that his success was scripted way back in Surat where he was born. I suspect it has something to do with an association with a person called Nirav Modi.
I'm not so sure of that, but thank you.
Vipul founded his first venture, FabMart, in 1999, at the time when everything.com was exploding and imploding. Apparently, the idea emerged from a conversation with Citibank. The bank had developed an online payment gateway and didn't know what to do with it. And that was the birth of his interest in e-commerce. We don't want to discuss what happened with Citibank's recent transactions, but this is quite amazing that, the bank creates this gateway and then you land up there and suddenly you think, wow, this can be a really interesting business idea. So that's how FabMart came into existence, I think 10 years ahead of its time. And even then, I believe people were willing to buy groceries even that time, right? So Vipul is a very sporty guy in every sense of the term. He plays badminton, table tennis, basketball, and like every corporate tycoon, golf as well. And he tells me recently that he also writes limericks. So I said, why don't you share one of your limericks with me? He said, I don't know, it's got to be contextual. I write about people. I don't know what's going to fit. I said, no, just send me something. It will fit. And I'm so happy he chose a topic that I really like, which is cricket. And this is what he sent me about England's humiliating defeat in the test match yesterday. I'm going to read out this limerick. It's just quite nice the way he's written it. With Ruth's deliveries turning square and Ashwin Aksar raiding England's cupboards bare, the Motera track made team composition key. Balance of spin pace decided the winner to be. In teams, a captain or coach will not be part of the story. A pitch diviner will now be mandatory. So thank you, Vipul, for accepting our invitation and all my badgering. And we're eagerly looking forward to listening to your fascinating story. If you don't reveal the Surat angle right now, I will call you after this call to figure it out. I just want to mention here that I think everyone is going to be on mute on this call. But we're going to be tracking the chat closely for questions. We're also thankful to all the seed business leaders who took the time and trouble to send their questions beforehand for Vipul. So we'll definitely weave that into the discussion today, but we'll keep it fairly informal where like Zia, if you find an interesting question pertinent to a particular theme that we're talking, please do step in and interrupt. And I'm sure Bindu, Abhishek and Arun will not mind. And Vipul, you have to just, I hope you're okay with that kind of fluidity.
Well, I'm absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
So over to you, and we are really looking forward to listening to your story.
Well, thanks, Nimi, for a wonderful and maybe slightly inglorious introduction. I must say I have nothing to do with any Modi whatsoever, and definitely not Nirav Modi right at the beginning. I've known Nimi for a long time. Nimi is a batchmate, also one of the smartest people I know. And she's taken on the hard part of building a really world standard product in India. And I know how hard it is because that's something which we aspired to when we started off. So all kudos to you, Nimi. You've been a role model, even though you may not know it. And I think, and it's really great that there are more people embarking on doing the hard things well. Rather than giving you a very formal introduction to what I've done and really sort of running through my resume, I thought I would really sort of divide my career for over 30 years into 4 distinct phases and really pick the one big learning that came through in each phase. And each of these phases, very neatly sort of boxes itself into one employer that I worked with or one company that I sort of worked with, whether my own or whether it was a third party. And so I thought that would be a good way to really start off. I started my career joining TVS, and unknown to me, it was a startup. And fortuitously, I think that really sort of shaped my career and really prepared me for what came ahead, and also shaped me quite dramatically, even though I didn't realize it then. I mean, 5 years in TVSC, I always look back and said, did I learn anything and was it really useful? And should I have done this? I shouldn't have. I joined one large FMCG company from campus. Would have been the best thing to do. I should have probably joined one IT major. But when I look back, I think the smartest thing, or actually not the smartest thing, the dumbest thing I did was to take the company that came along. And I liked the looks of it. And I said, okay, fine, let me just go join it. And that in retrospect turned out sort of really shaped my career the way I see it today. TVS Electronics was started by the TVS Group to manufacture computer peripherals in India. So it was a hard task. And you had to build a brand and you had to sell this. And I joined in marketing and then moved to sales almost immediately. And I had absolutely no clue of sales. So when I joined within 2 months of joining, they said, you go to Bombay. We don't have anybody in Bombay. So why don't you set up our Western region and please go find clients. And there are some people that we are supplied to. Please try and collect money from them. So I spent the next good part of 3 years trying to figure out what sales is all about. And I approached the job with a lot of trepidation. I had no clue what sales was about. I didn't know how to sell. I'd never sold anything in my life before. Nobody taught me a thing or even told me anything. I hadn't gone on a single sales call before that in my life. So I landed up in Bombay and I'm working out at a Sundaram Clayton office with a telex for company. And that was my instant messaging device in those days. And for those of you who don't know what a telex is, please Google it. It's a very interesting device and takes some real hard work to master. So working with the telex and working with practically rudimentary knowledge of what sales was, I started my career trying to sell computer peripherals to fairly battle-hardened businessmen in Bombay, all of whom were, I was sort of like a babe in the woods, got eaten up alive in the first 6 months, and then learned the what sales was all about, how to collect money, what to really go and tell customers. And the one abiding lesson that came out of this 5 to 6 year stint that I did with TVS Electronics was that you can learn anything. And that's one lesson which has been brought back to me again and again and again. And I'll talk about how it's turned up again and again in my life, is that you can learn anything when somebody holds a fire to your bottom. Right? It's as simple as that. When you yourself want to, sort of motivate yourself and get it done, like going to the gym, 6 times a week, or trying to learn a new language, you'll find it very, very hard. But the moment you create a situation where there's enough pressure on you, you can learn just about anything. And I realized that very quickly. I became a good salesman. I did very well for the company. I also learned a couple of secondary lessons. You need to be extremely patient if you want to be good at sales. After spending 3 to 4 hours in offices waiting for somebody to give me a meeting or waiting for me to give an answer, so I became very good at staring at a blank wall for 3 hours and not losing my cool. And I also learned that you don't trust anybody with money. If you can't, as a salesperson, if you can't figure out how to collect money, you're dead and buried. And unless you therefore knew how you're going to sell, but before that, if you knew how you're going to get your money back, because nobody's going to pay you, and you can be, they can be very nice to you. And in fact, my best customers, the ones who treated me best, were the ones who never paid. And so it was a hard lesson. So I said, money needs to be something which comes up front, and you should know how to collect it before you really embark on a sales process. But the abiding lesson from those 5.5 years that I spent with TVS Electronics was just this, that you can learn anything. And I learned sales, I learned computer peripherals, I learned how to sell a technical product, which I didn't know anything about. I learned how to actually go and demonstrate a product. And these are products which had to interface with systems which I had no clue about how they would work, software, hardware, and I still managed to do that. And therefore, the lesson that stayed with me was you can learn anything. And about 5 years into TVC, I get transferred to the head office in product marketing. Within 6 months, I decamped and joined Wipro, which was a large IT major at that point in time. It was a big brand, multiple businesses. I felt it was good to join a larger company. And Wipro was very different from TVS Electronics. It was like chalk and cheese. This was a very large, very organized, very planned, very bureaucratic, very egalitarian in a way company, which had its own way of doing things, had been built up from the ground up by a very strong personality, Mr. Premji, who also had a very unique style of functioning. And in those 5 years with Wipro, and I did multiple things with Wipro before, and all of them were in product marketing. The one thing which I learned was the power of process. One thing which Premji sort of, I think, drilled into everybody who's a Wiproite was really the power of process. Somewhere in the middle of my tenure, about 2 years into Wipro, which was, I think, about if I remember right, 1995, 96, Premji became really obsessed with making sure that Wipro became world-class in delivering IT service quality, or world-class in every quality aspect. So the way he chose to implement that, and it's a textbook lesson in terms of how a large organization, how you can create change in a large organization, and it helps even in small organizations. But this is really wonderfully done. One of the first meetings I remember going to was where he called all the large, all the senior vice presidents, the vice presidents, the business heads, the marketing heads, all the sales heads into one single room, and said, starting today, quality will be the foremost objective of this company. And he says, just to make sure that you understand what I'm saying, is that every review will compulsorily, mandatorily begin with a review of what you have achieved on your quality objectives. And this will be true for every employee in the company. And for those employees who cannot adhere to this, doesn't matter what level they are in this company, they do not have a place in Wipro. So it was a very blunt, very candid, and very focused statement. But more importantly, it was ruthlessly followed up. Every review, every objective, every appraisal that we would actually begin with reviewing what your quality objectives were and what did you achieve on them. And nobody did well unless they did well on the quality objectives. You could have done spectacularly if a salesperson overachieved your quotas 200%, but if you did not meet your quality objectives, you're probably in the bottom pile. And that message went through the organization so remarkably that in about 2 years, Wipro just transformed itself from a very Indian quality kind of lackadaisical attitude towards quality to becoming a very focused, highly productive, very quality conscious, and very focused and committed organization. And I saw the transformation happen. And making an elephant dance, which is what this was really about, because Wipro even then was a very, very large company and thousands of people. It's very, very difficult. And I think Premji achieved that. And the lesson that I learned from that is that the power of process, people don't understand how difficult it is to implement process, how important it is to implement process, and the transformation that processes when implemented well can achieve. And I think that was the lesson I learned from Premji and my stint in Wipro. In addition to a lot of other things, Premji was also a very frugal guy, notoriously frugal. And I think it taught us frugality. It took it to a different level of extreme. I remember, and this is a funny anecdote, I was traveling with my boss. He was an old Wipro. I had been with Wipro for a very long time, a good confidant of Premji. And we were traveling to Mysore for inauguration of a factory. And he said, I have bought my son, and in those days, the Maruti Zen had just got introduced. And he says, I bought my daughter a Zen car. Now I'm worried because Premji has bought his son only a Maruti 800. So he used to be like that. And that is and Premji was the kind of person, and I've gone on calls with him, used to visit regions. He would never hire a car. You had to get a auto and get into an auto with him and go for a call. And it used to be so embarrassing, turning up at a meeting in an auto and telling our dealers and business partners or the companies visited, chairman of my company, we have come in an auto. Now we need to flag another auto to get someplace from here. But the fact that he did that really set the tone and tenor and the culture of the company. And I think that's one of the abiding lessons from Premji. Build processes, build strong cultures, and I think the rest will take care of itself. And which is why Wipro really became a very successful company. Even today, amongst IT companies, I continue to believe they are an amazing company and will continue to do very, very well, very, very well. So I left Wipro. The last six months in Wipro, I was transferred to the business development function in Wipro, which was a newly created function as part of the corporate group. And the task I was given was to set up the corporate intranet for Wipro. Internet was just becoming a buzzword then, and Wipro felt it was time for them to start using it themselves if they wanted to sell it to customers. So the task was saying, can you implement a robust internet intranet for Wipro and figure out what the intranet strategy should be? And so I did that for about 6 months. And as part of that, I realized this was a fabulous growth area. And coincidentally ran into a couple of old colleagues, and we decided to take the jump. And we met Citibank, and Citibank had this payment gateway, but no customers. They said, why don't you set up a store? Somebody will buy, and therefore I can use my payment gateway. Otherwise, we don't know what to do with our payment gateway. So that's how we got started. And the third phase, which was really the FabMart phase, where we set up an online e-commerce store 10 years ahead of Flipkart, doing what Flipkart or Amazon does. And the third lesson I learned during that FabMart phase, that you can be spectacularly wrong. That the smartest of people can go so wrong that you can't believe it. And therefore, it's always wise to keep your ego in check. Also, to always make sure that keep checking that you've not made a significant mistake. Otherwise, you can go completely awry. And I think and this was a time when where the whole world was going online. We had investors queuing up to invest in us, some of the best investors in the world. In fact, our first investor was Reliance Industries. And that's an interesting story in itself, but I'll probably pick it up later. And we had, therefore, great set of investors, great set of employees. Everybody was dying to meet us. All the smart people from HUL, the FMCG companies wanted to work for e-commerce companies in their marketing departments. Fortunately, we never hired one. And therefore, there was a huge amount of euphoria. And some of the best investors in the world, really smart guys, some of the best smart people in the world, and we thought we were smart, all thought this would work. And it all went completely spectacularly wrong in just about 2-3 years. So one of the key lessons was that you can make spectacular mistakes. However smart you are, you can read it completely wrong. And sometimes even the cohort or the best group of the best people can also get it wrong. It's not just a single person who can get it wrong. You can get it wrong across multiple people. But the key thing, and I think that's what really changed things for us, is to recognize when things go wrong and really eat humble pie and pivot. And which is what we did. We realized 2 years into FabMart that this online story in India is going to take a long time. People are going to take time to come online. This is not going to happen in a hurry. There is just not enough, there's not just enough people with connections at home. And this will probably take a decade before things change. So we said, let's not do this. Let's just become a physical retailer. We at least have learned something about retail, become a physical retailer. And becoming a physical retailer, and we chose groceries because we felt grocery was the largest business, was also a very daunting task. We didn't know anything about physical retail. Not that we knew anything about online retail, we ventured into it. But again, coming back to my first lesson, you can learn anything. So we set about building a physical retailer from scratch. And from first principles, we really didn't have anybody to look up to or learn from. The physical retail, there was only one large physical retailer in grocery in those days, which was Food World. And there was nothing much that we could learn from them. In fact, a lot of the learning actually came from HBS case studies than from anything else, honestly. And then we said, okay, fine, let's learn this, we'll build this. And we got started, built that business out over the next 4 years. Fortunately for us, it worked. We focused on building a great brand or building a great product. And I think that is where I learned, and one of the things that I've always abided by, that your brand really gets built by a product and nothing else. And so the fourth lesson, the Fab Mall lesson, was really the physical retail lesson, was that a great brand is built by a great customer experience. A great customer experience comes from great product design. And therefore, a lot of success really comes from building a great product, and very little of it comes from marketing. Marketing just adds the top layer. While it's useful, it never really guarantees success, never really builds a great brand. And I think that was the fourth abiding lesson that I learned. And fortunately for us, that ended well. I spent about 2-3 years investing, both formally and informally, working with the private equity firm, before we got back to starting BigBasket in late 2011. And the idea was really, we had a bruised ego from our online foray, and we had some experience in grocery. We said, let's marry both and let's get started. And that's how BigBasket got formed, and our journey really got started. I hope that was useful. I'm happy to take questions. I think I've taken a fair bit of time really talking about what I wanted to talk about. Nemi, happy to take any questions that you have
No, absolutely. No. This is fascinating stuff. And I'm going to call upon Bindu Subramaniam, who will be asking you the first few questions.
Thank you so much for this inspiring lecture. I found so many things that I think that we should all take away from this. Great brand to great product is, I think, something that we need to just keep chanting again and again in our minds when we think about how we should build something resilient and long lasting. We've had a few questions that have been submitted by cohort leaders and people who are attending the session. And from you. So the first question is, what are your learnings from your career and the techniques that you use in establishing the right organizational culture? What kind of culture or set of values is best suited for scaling?
So, building culture is a very interesting thing to do. And I know there's a lot of books that you'll read on culture. And there's a lot of, and organizations have different cultures. And no two organizations are alike. But one of the things that I've learned, especially if you are as a founder trying to build a culture, and we are a group of founders, and we are also disparate in our own way. So how do you build a uniform culture? What do you really communicate? And one thing I learned is that you can never stray too far from what you are. Right? Just like your company can't stay too far from the product, you can't stray too far from the culture, from the way you are. So building a culture a lot of times really is about making sure that you exemplify your beliefs. What does it mean? What do you believe in? Are you communicating that? Are you showing that very, very clearly? What happens with a lot of people is that you're not very demonstrative when it comes to your beliefs. You don't state them explicitly. You don't actually showcase them very explicitly. And I think that becomes very important. So let me give you some examples, because this is a very interesting discussion that we had time and again. And I think a lot of the credit that I would think that comes to us as BigBasket founders really comes because of the culture that we build, and very little in terms of what we've really done with the company. I think a lot of that has really been done by teams. And I think if you look at any organization, it starts off with people. There are three things that you're really trying to do. One, you want to make sure that your employees trust you. You want to communicate with them that you trust them. Right? That's number one. And that's very important. Second, you want to make sure that it's an open organization. People are willing to give you feedback. You are willing to take feedback. you are willing to give feedback, you are able to take hard decisions and able to do it in an atmosphere which is absolutely open. These are very important things for startups and young organizations. The third is frugality. And I talked about Premji and his example, and he was doing that at Wipro scale. And so I can't think of a better example than really demonstrating how frugal can you be. And this is in a business which is very high EBITDA compared to our business, which is very low gross margins and EBITDA. So therefore, I think that speaks volumes about how we go about it. But the two things about trust and about building an atmosphere of openness, how do you do it? And I'll tell you the things that we have done, or we have actually let things happen, let me put it that way, which really communicates that. So one of the things about openness is that the three of us, we started this company, the first company that spectacularly bombed way back in 1999. And we were colleagues in our first job, which was in 1988. So we worked together for almost about 30 years. So we know each other well. But having said that, we can't seem to see eye to eye on anything, right? So we are, most of the time, and we've got comfortable with that, is that we have really great disagreements, and we fight. We fight all the time. In fact, the first few meetings that our first employees joined, they were most worried about. One of the feedback I got in our first appraisals is, will you guys stay together? The way you fight, we don't think you guys are ever going to. So I told them, don't worry. We've been doing this for 10, 15 years. We got used to fighting with each other. We'll fight and we'll forget about it next day and we'll go back to it. And I think really demonstrating that, the fact that you can actually fight, you can disagree, but then still come to a single decision which works for everyone. And setting that example ourselves worked very well. And I've made sure that we do the same thing with all teams. So our teams are very, very comfortable disagreeing with us. They're quite, somebody the other day said, Vipul, that's an idiotic idea. And I thought for a minute, oh shit, I think I better figure out what did I say and where did I go wrong? But the fact is that they had the comfort to say it, really speaks volumes. And I think really building that openness, and that comes from the behavior that you exhibit, and also being relatively secure yourself. If you are not secure, and if you think, my ego is going to get hurt, you start demonstrating anger, or you start withdrawing from a conversation if somebody really engages with you very spiritedly, you are actually exemplifying a culture which is exactly opposite of what you want to do. And I think that is the hard thing. Making sure that at every point in time, you are able to show that behavior consistently over years builds organization culture. The second thing about trust is really letting people, giving them a job and then letting them do it, right? So the typical issue when you become a new manager, and I keep working with new managers all the time, so I realize is that you know how to do it. So your tendency to actually micromanage and to get it done, even if you're a nice guy, you'll still be looking over the shoulder and making sure that even the to-do list of the person who has to do the task is managed by you. And I think that's what really gets going and gets very, very difficult for people. People don't learn and they become very defensive, and they start to think that, I can't think, I need to go back to my boss to think, and he has to approve. And therefore building that culture where you actually get, either you coach people, then let them lose. Don't review again. Let them perform. If they don't perform, review it later. Let them say it if they do not perform. People are not largely smart. They figure out if they've done well or not done well. Most of the times you think people don't realize they've not done well. They know it, but they don't want to admit it because they're afraid that you will actually be treat them very poorly if they do. The fact is, once people realize that there is no negativity when you go back and tell that you've not done well, people tend to accept it, and they're very open. They understand that they screwed up. They very quickly manage. And our greatest successes have come from people who don't know anything about anything doing things that they shouldn't be doing, right? And we've realized that you can give people tremendous responsibilities. Our head of supply chain today, and we are a very complex supply chain. We are one of the most complex supply chains of any retailer in the country today. We handle fresh, we handle 100,000 products. We have distributed sourcing centers across the country. We run a network of just-in-time supply chain. We have network of dark stores, distribution centers, regional distribution centers, national distribution centers, collection centers, and all of these work like clockwork. And is a guy who started managing our inventory in our first warehouse. And he's the guy who actually manages the entire network today. And he's the smartest, smarter than any of us, person in the company today. And his ability to think through how to create processes, how to train people, how to make sure that these work, how to manage them is second to none. So therefore, just letting people do it and letting them go on with the task really makes a big difference. So showing the culture that you want is actually very, very important rather than really stating it.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. The second question is, how do you maintain company culture in an organization of your size where many of your employees are not very educated? So how do you manage to keep a culture across a company of that size where much of the workforce is not educated?
That, Bitu, is one, obviously making sure that all managers have been exposed to the culture. They're all trained. They see it from the second level, from third level. And so the question that really comes to it, how do I know that, let's say, the distribution center head in Delhi, who I've never met, also shares in the same culture? The only way I know by doing that is by making sure that his manager and the manager of this person who manages that distribution center, all of them have the same culture. And that really comes back to saying, is your first line of reportees, do they have exhibit the same culture? And that you need to manage, monitor, coach, and get people to change very, very quickly. And there are times when you can't shape people. And to us, those are hard decision-making points, but we typically take the calls that we take in such instances are really to part. Because we can train, we can teach, we can solve for a lot of things. We can't solve for attitude, which we think defines culture. And that becomes very, very hard. Right? The other point is, how do you then take blue collar rank and file, and which is really people who are delivery people who may be with the organization for a very short time. And if you look at a turnover in this business, good companies, our turnover is about 6 to 7% a month, right? So essentially in a year, I'll be turning over the entire workforce, which is 30,000 people. So how do you make sure that the person who's delivering knows what the culture of Big Basket is? And how do we coach him? And do I have the luxury for training him for 6 months? He's there in the organization for an average 6 months. So I really don't have that, right? We can't afford it. So therefore, we have to figure out a process by training them, getting them up to speed within 2 weeks. And the way we do that is through a combination of training and on-site coaching. So the way it works and let me give an example of for delivery people, is that we have the first 2 weeks, a delivery person works with another person who's a trained one, who's been identified, who's the coach, and he has to work with him to deliver. And he learns from that person's behavior. So the skills, the attitude, person by osmosis and by observance than by anything else. And that's one way of making sure that the culture sort of continues to replicate.
Thank you. We have one more culture question from Jatin in the chat, and that is culture eats strategy. What's your reflection on this adage?
Both of them have a place. I mean, you can have the greatest of culture. If you don't have a strategy, you'll still be eaten by somebody else. So I think you need to have, it's a balance between both.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to my friend Abhishek, who's going to ask you the next questions relating to marketing.
Thanks, Bindu. And thank you so much for such a candid discussion, Vipul. So what I want to ask you is, what we understand is that the best brands are typically built with zero marketing. This is said by some of the best marketers. And I just want to ask you, in today's world of digital marketing and brands scrambling to have their message go viral, is there a success formula to achieve this virality somehow? That people talk about you?
I think, the problem is like this. Virality has sort of taken over, as a marketing strategy. I mean, virality is not marketing strategy. You can't design virality. Virality doesn't happen. If it happens, good luck to you. And it's like winning a lottery. And if you're going to base your business on virality, I don't think I'm going to get anywhere, fundamentally. So I think that the key issue is really what people get wrong in the initial days of building an organization is really understanding, is your product designed well enough? And let me give you some examples and why I keep coming back to product as opposed to marketing or virality or digital marketing or anything else in terms of building a customer base for your product. It's because if you get your product right, you can pick a niche. It doesn't have to be. It can be the smallest of niche, But as long as you identified the pain point, you figured out how you serve that pain point well, and you're really solving for a customer need, you will find that your customer adoption will be will grow geometrically rather than horizontally. And I think this happens. So I'll give you an example. We started BigBasket when we first started it. We chose to launch it only in Bangalore, right? And with zero marketing.
Okay.
And we were in Bangalore for 2 years before we launched in another 2 cities. And for the first 4 years, we were only in 3 cities.
Right.
After 9 years that we've been, and we are in some 40 cities today. But for the first 4 years, we actually chose to be only in 3 cities with only a limited supply. And we said, we will get the product right. We'll make sure that customers are happy. We will iron out all kinks in it. And we'll make sure that customers have a great experience. But the metric that we set for ourselves was very different, and which is what Nimi has done, and which is why I really hold her as a role model, is that we set a global standard. We said we will set our benchmark of our deliverables, of our customer experience to international standards. And we said our benchmarks are Amazon in the US and Ocado in the UK. And these two Ocado was a grocery player in the UK, pretty large, huge company, run on AI, ML, significant technology investments, more technology investments than our revenue. So therefore, very, very, great processes, great customer metrics. And similarly, Amazon had years of experience in building that entire famous Amazon customer experience. We said, we will set our customer experience standards to the same level, and we'll define how do we get there. And most people think it's about saying, okay, let me see Amazon NPS, and if I can get my NPS to go there, I'll get there. It never happens like that. The amount of granularity that you need to get into product design, people underestimate. So for example, I'll give an example. We send our stuff in crates to customers' houses, right? So it comes in a packed crate. We don't use packaging because we think it's a waste. We take the case and the crates back. The crates are all sealed by tamper-proof clamps, those plastic clamps that you see,
right,
that you find in luggage in the airports. And so those are sealed. Now, these are sharp, right? So the guy goes there, he cuts it and opens it for the customer. Customer takes delivery. So one of the things that we saw when we started observing this entire process is that 2 things. One, he will go and ask the housewife for a scissor first, right? He's not carrying a scissor. So number one, he has to carry a scissor every time he cuts it. Second thing, when he cuts it, he has to pick it up and put it in his pocket. You can't leave it lying on the floor, because if you step on it, it hurts your bare feet. Indian houses, everybody's on bare feet, right? So it hurts you if you step on it. So imagine now training a guy who stays with you only for 6 months to follow a process where he goes into a household, uses a scissor, every time carries a scissor, uses a scissor, cuts it, puts it in his pocket every time, and brings it back, right? So you have to get to that level of detail to really make sure that your product experience is great. So simple things like that. For the other thing we did, for example, is that we offer voice service. Now, it's a luxury in today's day. We've decided that it helps build the brand. It helps people make comfortable. But it's extremely irritating to get a recorded message. I abhor the times that I need to call Airtel, because I'll be on one maze of pre-recorded messages, and it takes you half an hour to get to resolve something. And you only choose to call only when you're stuck and you can't find a solution anywhere else. And at that point in time, when you choose to call a voice center, you just can't get any help at all. So one of the standards we set for ourselves is that 95% of our calls will be answered in 3 rings. And we still hold it today, right? 95% of calls to a BigBasket call center will be answered in 3 rings. Yeah, and you will not be greeted by a pre-recorded message. A person will pick up at the other end and will answer your query. And on top of that, then we track what you call first call resolution, which means on that call, did your issue get resolved? So if we have a 95% for that, we have a 95% for first call resolution. And when you get these two, the number of times a customer has an error and it gets resolved very quickly becomes very, very high. So getting very micro with your metrics and getting very micro and great granularity in terms of product experience is what really builds the brand. So that creates that layer of satisfied customers. I have customers in Bangalore who have been buying from us since 1999, right? And we run some of the highest customer retention metrics in the world today of e-commerce startups. And that's sitting in India, right? If you look at any of our metrics, whether it's customer retention, whether it's on-time delivery, whether it's fill rate, whether it's number of returns, whether it's number of calls for every order or number of complaints per order, everything is actually in the topmost metrics in the world. You would compare very well with Amazon, with anybody else in the world. And I think that's how you, with that attention to granularity, is how you build a great customer brand. And that then goes on to new customers. People buy because they trust you. And a brand is built by retained customers. It is not built by customers sampling you once.
Of course, of course. So my second question to you, Vipul, is like, how do you create awareness in markets before you enter them? So, for example, you entered into many markets after you did the
Right.
first cities over a certain number of years. So, how do you create so much of awareness in new markets that you enter so that you are received well and you can recover your new investments in those markets?
So I think 2-3 strategies that we used, and these work in different ways. A combination of them works well. One is encourage trial. So you can encourage trial by 2-3 things. One, you can offer the product, offer a great discount, offer a great incentive, or create a non-financial incentive for customers to sample it. So it could be as simple as, so when we launched in Bangalore, and this was the first cities, right? So nobody knew about BigBasket and we were launching. So we said, what do we tell customers? So we took a database of all the IT professionals in the city and sent out an email to them, which costs us nothing, telling them that if you buy from us, we will give you 10% off on all your groceries for the whole year. Right? Now, obviously that cost me money, but the fact is that cost of that, if I'd taken an ad in Times of India, that would have been more, one ad in Times of India would have cost me more than that entire cost on that promotion. So there are a lot of because you're not aiming for some 1 billion customers to come in and join you on day one. You're really trying to get a cohort of customers who are large enough who can build a base from which you can actually effectively build more customers. So that works well. So to get the initial cohort going, the first step, encourage trial. Trial can be through free usage, can be through incentives, could be financial, non-financial. The second thing which works on top of that is referral. We found that you can actually encourage customers to refer. And happy customers are very happy to refer. They take great pride in referring because they feel that they've discovered something which is of value to their friends and everybody else. And they will actually go ahead and tell customers saying that you should buy. Right? So those customers which come through referral are some of the stickiest customers that you can find. So that's the second layer, which really is coming from referral. And the third is then you are supplementing marketing efforts on top of that. Right. But most of your the initial base really comes from trial and from referral.
So I have a just follow-up question on this. So obviously you have got 30,000 employees who are going out and delivering goods on every day. So have you leveraged your employees to obviously they are creating the voice in people's mind because make people have great experience and people come and buy. But have they you utilize them to directly increase the sale by doing word of mouth, by directly them using a referral program to kind of generate more revenue from your existing employee base itself?
We don't, because they have a tight schedule and really don't want to. And also they train for a role. Now this is a guy who's got a limited role, understands the limited role. For me now to train him to be a good salesperson also becomes very hard. And then we really are stretching ourselves. So that's hard. But what we realize is that this, all products have a network effect. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we observed very quickly when we started in Bangalore was that once we started going to an apartment, automatically our number of people coming from the same apartment started going up. And the reason that happened was one was obviously word of mouth. The other was people started seeing this van coming there, which was branded BigBasket, which had all the messaging there. And the van would be stationed there for an hour, delivered. So people got curious saying, what is that? Let me try it. And let me see if this is something that I want to try. So that creates, people see you, the physical manifestation, and that creates a lot of opportunity. So the way you deliver, the way you present also makes a lot of opportunity. One of the things we've really learned is that while we don't use them directly, that our delivery people are our biggest salespersons.
Right.
And the reason is because the way the guy does it, we get so many compliments every month. Customers writing in, this guy was so nice. I told him this is not well. He said, this doesn't look okay. I'll take it back. I ordered something wrongly and I told him, can you take it back? He said, I'll take it back. And he was absolutely pleasant about it. He smiled and he was very helpful. He didn't take a tip when I asked him to take a tip. So all of those, and I think this customers see these behaviors and they respond to them. And that actually encourages involvement with the brand, encourages their, sort of intensifies their emotional connect with the brand. And that prompts them to go refer, prompts them to say good things about the brand, and that builds on it.
Thank you, Vipul. Thanks for answering our queries on this front. Thanks.
Thanks.
I think Arun, are you around? Arun Jagannathan?
Yes, just one second.
Over to you, Arun.
Yeah. So just one second, please. I'll just. Yeah. So, hello, Vipul, and thanks so much for the time.
Hi, Arun.
Hi. So the questions that I wanted to ask were more around the whole investment route and how you went around raising funds. So specifically, the question that a lot of us who want to raise some kind of venture capital have is, how does it really work in terms of negotiation between, so when you had to raise rounds, so how did you go about talking to the investors? So one school of thought is you have to be very specific and pick the right kind of investors who understand the value. But at the same time, you also have the other, spectrum where you want to talk to a lot of investors. What has been your experience on that?
So I think, let me start at a different note there. More than the process of negotiation and selection, what I've found is that your reputation precedes you. Always, when you go to raise capital, one of the things that I've found that time and again, and this has been, I've been raising capital for the last 10 years, practically every year. I don't think a year has gone, unfortunately, that I have not had to raise capital. And I think, so that's one thing which has taught me is that, like it or not, your reputation is there. People know who you are, what you stand for, including the first time we raised capital. The first time we raised capital from Reliance, and we hadn't even formed the company. And we just got together and said, we will start doing this. And we're still going to register the company and get it done. We got a call from Jitendra Thakkar, who was the IT head for Reliance in those days, and saying that, we know you guys are trying to do this. Can you come to Bombay on Saturday? Manoj Bhai and Mukesh Bhai want to meet you. And within some 24 hours of meeting them, they wired the money to our bank. So, and I think that the call, the thing about that, while it was very lucky, and in retrospect seems, like a stroke of good luck, and which it was, I think it got triggered because they knew our professional reputations. We'd worked in the IT companies, we'd supplied to Reliance. They knew how we had engaged with them, and they were very comfortable. And Reliance is sort of a company which does a lot of personal diligence. They will know what kind of person you are, how you behave, how you have conducted yourself. So they've done all that, and we sort of tick marked all their boxes. And they came calling and said, "We'll." And this happened the second time. We did this venture with Reliance, and which bombed, and everybody lost their shirt. And in that venture, we had a great investor called Chris Capital. Chris Capital was set up by two partners, and they and this is now one of the foremost private equity firms in the country. I think now the corpus is probably about $3 or $4 billion, and they were just getting started. Then we were one of the first investments. They liked us, and they said we'll invest. They invested about $15 million, lost all of it promptly when this entire business went to bust. But when we started in 2011, when we started Big Basket, the first person, and we were meeting people, and it was a hard decision, and we were meeting people, and one of the people that we met was this partner from Chris Capital who had venture capital business, and he said, I love you guys. I'm going to invest. I know it failed then, but you guys are a great team. You got it wrong. I don't think we'll get it wrong a second time. And within meeting him, we signed a term sheet, and we raised a fairly large Series A, which was pretty large for those days, about $10 million. And this was for a company which was, very little revenue, but just a good team, and which had some experience. So I think, again, our reputation sort of led us to close the deal more than anything else. But after that, what I've noticed is that if you want to raise capital, and especially there are three things that you have to look at. One, an investor is typically looking at three of your capabilities. One, your individual capabilities and your team's capabilities. Team of founders or the founder himself, they're really looking at your capabilities and trying to assess, are you the right person for the job, right? The second capability that they're looking at is your product's capabilities. What have you built? Is this good enough? Is this going to cut meet the smell, the taste test in the market? And is this going to endure? The third thing that they're looking at, and this is something which founders don't sometimes take cognizance of, is the market's capabilities, which has nothing to do with you or your product. They're really assessing the market and saying, is this a market that I want to be in? Is this the kind of market which is going to be large enough? Is this a market which is going to grow significantly? Is this a market which where new startups can actually scale and make money? And this assessment, and you need to tick the boxes on all three, right? So therefore, when it comes to selecting which funds that you want to target, sometimes it's useful to start from the third one. Really looking at saying, worrying less about stage and saying, who are the funds who are interested in similar markets or who are or in contiguous markets, and they are probably a best bet to work with. But having said that, once you identified that list, just go to everybody. Don't worry about too much about who's likely to be, who meets your standards, or who has invested last, or who's raised a large fund or not raised a large fund, or who's got a reputation, doesn't have a reputation. It's useful to meet everybody, because you never know what's going to resonate with one particular individual. And what I found is that as long as you tick mark the first two boxes, which are within your control, which is your capabilities and your product's capabilities, you'll always find somebody to fund you. The terms may be exactly what you want, may not be exactly what you want, they may be high, they may be low. But you will find an investor, which I've very rarely found good teams and good products not to find an investor. And which is the point that I was trying to communicate, saying there is always an investor out there for you.
Great. And you mentioned this interesting thing that the same investor came back to you, he trusted the team, and you were able to raise 10 million. So this valuation, how do we go about with this negotiation? What is the basis? There is DCF framework and all that, but how do you really get to it?
I think, see, my philosophy there is a little different and also very simple. My philosophy is dilution has never killed anybody. Lack of money has. Right? Dilution has never killed any startup. It is only lack of money that has really killed startups. So if you need the money, I don't think you should worry too much about dilution.
Right.
Obviously, don't take stupid terms, because there are certain thumb rules, but at the end of the day, this is not a science. When you're raising early stage, unless you're a large company, DCF doesn't make any sense. While investors will say, I'll do DCF, you are doing it on Excel. Excel numbers can be anything. You can show whatever numbers you want on Excel, and you can show whatever DCF you want. And it has absolutely no value. So end of the day, I think if you look at investors, typically investors are solving for two things. They're solving for a stake, and they're solving for a quantum of money that they'll invest. And that defines investors. If you take a seed investor will invest between $200,000 to maybe $500,000 and will want anywhere from 5 to 10% stake. A series investor will invest maybe 1 million to 3 million or 5 million and may want 15 to 20% stake or 10% stake. So I think the boundaries naturally get defined by the investors themselves. It's very unlikely that if a seed investor comes and says, I'll give you $500,000 and I want 51% of the company, run. Because he's not the kind of investor that you need to go to. But these boundaries have been defined. There is nothing much. You have some room to maneuver depending on how hungry the investor is, how much interest do you get. But I think those boundaries are already defined for you. There's not much that you need to really do. So I don't think you need to worry about learning DCF and worry about how to make the best Excel and worry about what to present. The investor will do their math and will come back to number. Your job is to figure out that it's within the broad parameters of what it should be and settle for something which works for you.
Right. And the last question I had on the valuation bit was a lot of startups, when they start off, with a plan, but many of the seed companies here are established and they are going, many of them pivoting into the online model. So what would be your advice for, both valuation and dilution for a company that is probably, 5 years old, has got some traction, but is looking for growth? Any difference in?
So I think, again, coming back to that, there are two things which will determine a valuation for such companies, right? At the end of the day, investors are really looking, where do they make the money? They make the money through growth. Because it's not, if they're buying shares at the currently, and your, let's say, company is correctly valued, whatever that valuation is, let's say X, if it's correctly valued, therefore, the investor is really going to make money if the company grows faster than market, gains share, or creates profits faster than what the market would. Now, so therefore, the investor is really trying to assess, saying what is the growth rate of this company. Now, as founders, we know very clearly you have a good fit of what your growth rate is: 30% a year, 50% a year, 100% a year, maybe starting at 100% a year, getting down to 50% a year, or maybe 10% a year. And these will really, and then you can actually backward calculate, because what does the investor in a risk asset want, right? No investor is going to be happy for anything less than a 15-20% IRR. Ideally, want the 30 or 40% IRR. But let's say if you to give a startup investor or even a small business investor, anything less than a 20% IRR is really not going to be happy. Now, if you need to deliver a 20% IRR over a period of 5 years, which means you essentially need to grow the company 3x, you need to be sure that you know what you're going to be able to deliver. That defines what the valuation should be. And you can do that math. Most founders can do the math on the back of a paper in 15 minutes, or not even 15 minutes, 5 minutes. So you know what your valuation is yourself. You don't need anybody to tell you what your valuation is. And always leave some money on the table. So if you think you can do 3x in 5 years, assume that you'll do 2x and price yourself accordingly. It's better to have a happy investor and with a little more money than a happy investor with a lot less money. And because that he will make your life miserable. He'll be sitting there at every board meeting. You're marrying an investor, and he's there with you for 5 to 7 to 10 years, and you don't really want somebody who's going to be very unhappy and distressed right through that journey. He'll definitely bring down performance rather than anybody else. So one of the things I've learned is always leave some money on the table, and that makes sure that you'll get more investors as they come along. This guy will always be happier, and it makes for a very smooth relationship.
Thank you, Vipul, for your insightful comments. Very useful. I'll hand it back to Nimi, so maybe she can conclude on that. So, thanks.
Zia, there are a bunch of really nice questions in the chat. Would you like to take them?
Yeah, sure, Nimi, thanks. I was on mute. You all can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I found one which was especially very interesting. And I think this was asked earlier in the pre-session as well. So
I think we lost.
Not very audible. Not audible at all.
I think we lost him. His connection seems to have gone off.
He's frozen, right?
Yes, definitely for me.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just wondering whether we should wait for him, or I have a question actually.
Sure, why don't you go ahead, and I think we can always, if he jumps in, we'll start out there.
So I was reading, an article written by Hari, your TN Hari.
Right.
And I found it quite interesting how he talks about BigBasket and compares BigBasket to Yahoo.
Oh, okay.
In a manner that makes BigBasket look really good. So what he says is that BigBasket has always seen itself as a retail company and not as a consumer internet or a technology company.
Right.
And to have that strong retail value proposition, you need to have a very deep understanding of warehousing, supply chain, logistics, dealing with farmers, merchandising, all of that.
Right.
And apart from all of that, you guys were also able to appreciate over time the disruptive nature of technology itself and the internet.
Right.
And therefore, build a high caliber tech team and leverage all those opportunities. Whereas a company like Yahoo could never see itself as a media company and instead saw itself as a technology company, which eventually resulted in their falling by the wayside.
Right.
So I just want to know whether there were any temptations to veer away from that DNA of being a purely retail company at any point in time when you found a lot of growth happening through consumer internet and technology. Was there what held your ground to staying with that retail, true to that, being a retail company?
No, all the time, the temptations galore for the simple reason that, tech companies get valued much more than retail companies.
Right.
So every time, our investors would say, I would go make a pitch, they would say, you should actually position yourself tech company. That's how you'll get more valuation. And I said, I don't want more valuation because finally we have to deliver on it. And if we can't deliver on it, all of you guys will be sitting on our heads. So therefore, I'm quite happy with what valuation we get. But I think, being serious, the key thing that really stood our ground was we believed very early on that unless we got our customer and product proposition right, and which we could do only by being a good retailer, we wouldn't really create any value in the company. Then there's no point in saying we're building great technologies, we are going to do something else, because then you're really, trying to ride the wave using a combination of luck and positioning, and really not building any substance in the company. So therefore, which was, for us, it was not a very comfortable situation to be in. And I think that the core belief that we had that the only way we could actually build value in the company, and this started by the way we set ourselves, the task that we set ourselves to do. We said we will build amongst the top 3 retailers in the country in grocery. That was our vision starting day one. And obviously then it looked impossible. We are probably there now. And I think we have a long way to go if we really want to break the top 2. But the fact is that we can get there. But that vision was very clear. That vision was very clear, saying that, this is what we want to do. And we said, if we have to be the top 2 or top 3 retailers, we have to be a retailer. We have to do all things that a retailer does well. And so therefore, there's no point in trying to compare ourselves to Facebook, Yahoo, Google, because we don't do any of those things. We don't sell advertising. We don't provide services. We really in the physical trading of products. And therefore, we need to make sure that we build a good retail brand, because that's what we are really delivering to customers. So that clarity of vision, what we wanted to do, I think sort of was our guiding light. And that kept us steadfast.
That's great to hear, because as you said, there are temptations galore, and you can start manipulating yourself by saying that, yeah, I should position myself as a tech company rather than, I don't know if Zia is your connection.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know where I got dropped off.
No, you didn't ask the question at all. We couldn't hear you.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you could keep your video off. That might help.
Okay, I think it should work now. So Vipul, one of the questions which has got posted is that obviously I think the pandemic was great for a lot of the online businesses.
Right.
And I'm sure BigBasket also benefited from everyone having to move to online for their shopping.
Right.
And as then customers have tasted the goodness and the convenience of not needing to commute, especially in the Indian market conditions where the traffic and the road conditions are not really ideal, how is BigBasket going to continue the growth strategically to meet the demand, from a technology perspective, new processes, logistics? Any thoughts on how can you build on, what the pandemic provided as an opportunity to be able to now continue building on that?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic temporarily obviously moved a significant number of customers online, and all online business benefited. And us definitely, because we were in the forefront of grocery is critical. People can't do without it. They can defer buying a television, but you can't defer buying groceries. So the business went through a significant upside. But it's also gone the other way around too. So, the fact is it's normalized also very quickly. And if you to look at what's happening today, people are back to the way they were behaving before the pandemic. So it's not that it's fundamentally changed customer acquisition, or it's obviously given us a whole set of new customers who have come in. A lot of them have stayed, and that's created a larger base of customers that we can leverage going forward. But in terms of fundamental behavior, customers haven't changed. So there's no abiding benefit except the fact that we have probably had a larger base of customers to start with the new year. But there are 2-3 things that it's taught us. One, I think it sort of proved the proof of the pudding into the strength of our processes. If you look at what happened in the pandemic, where this was a surprise lockdown, nobody knew what was going to happen, and people couldn't venture out, and delivery process got disrupted, supply chains got disrupted. We were the first people to bounce back. We were operational within a week of the lockdown. We scaled the fastest, we delivered the highest, and customers really loved us for that. And I think, and the fact that the organization, bounced back again goes back to the strength of the process that I was talking about. The fact that we built that by design into the framework of the company really benefited us in hindsight. And that's why we were able to get back, we were able to scale, we were able to start delivering to more customers, we were able to design tech to, but there are 2 lessons that the pandemic has taught us, I think, which will work with us, will stay with us for a long time. One, it's taught us the importance of really being prepared for any eventuality. So how do you prepare? How do you make the organization, and as you get scale, this becomes more relevant, how do you make the organization more resilient to dangers which you can't even think of? Recurrent risks are something that you can think of. There'll be a strike tomorrow, there'll be flooding in Chennai next year in monsoon, there will be road closings in Bangalore, at least half of the roads, at least half of the year. So those are recurrent risks. You deal with them. You figured out how to deal with them. You know what's going to happen. But there are non-recurrent risks which you can't foresee, which you can't plan for. How do you make sure that your organization is can weather them and can bounce back, and it is not cataclysmic? So I think handling this pandemic has really taught us those lessons. How do you design an organization to be far more resilient when you are faced with a risk which you've not foreseen at all? And then we realized that it happens by two things. One, by making sure that your supply chains are segmented, that you're not dependent on any one single supply chain for it to go down. So our entire supply chain today is completely segmented. One collection center could shut down, one part of the country could shut down, one part of the city could shut down, one part of the state could shut down, and you would continue operating. And it wouldn't make any difference to the rest of the parts. So making sure that we build that independence in supply chain, and more importantly, making sure that we have the technology which supports this at the back end. Because if you look at our business, it's such a complex business. We're doing millions of orders, 12, 15 million orders a month, and all of them have to deliver on time in very short time. There is no way we can do this without a very strong foundation of technology. Now, the problem with having technology is that unless the technology is flexible enough, if your process change and your technology does not, you have a disaster. If you have risk, resilience in your supply chain, but you don't have risk resilience in your technology, or technology is not flexible enough, or is not compartmentalized enough to be able to manage this change, then you have a problem. So really, the abiding lesson that the pandemic has taught us, and it's really fortified both our supply chain design and our tech designs. Our entire tech stack, therefore, has got changed. At supply chain, we have strengthened it by making sure that we build that resilience into it.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. There's another question actually relating to frugality, which you had mentioned, especially during your Wipro years. Do you see any downside or disadvantage for the organization due to the frugality of the founders?
People will curse you and bitch about you, but I don't think there's any downside, honestly. I mean, and you need to give them a reason to complain, and I think this is a good enough reason. Let's put it that way.
Got it.
So we used to always complain about how stingy Wipro was. But when I look back and when I think about it now, I think it's probably one of the best lessons it's taught me. It's so important to have a frugal culture, because that's always useful. You abhor waste, and therefore design the organization accordingly.
A little bit of a sneaky question. Can you give us some things about the recent investment and how did it materialize, and what's kind of the way forward, whatever you're able to share and are comfortable sharing?
I'll tell you what's in the public domain, which I can, and some of it which is not. So again, this was a very interesting, and this is the third time this happened to us. I told you that earlier 2 times. This was again a call which originated from that. We had actually closed the funding round. We had raised capital. We were on our way, and we had actually signed off with a bunch of large investors who were investing a significant amount of capital in the company. And then we get a call from the Tata Sons chairman saying, we think we would be a good fit. Can we partner? And then we said, it's too late. I think we've already signed off everything, and this is a little late in the day to begin this conversation. But then we started thinking about it, and I think both of us, both sides met. We found there's a lot of common ground. One of the things where we realized is that it's a great company to work with, strong brand, great legacy, very open-minded, very trustworthy people that you can, and the sort of team that we felt we could work with. More importantly, I think they have significant plans in terms of the digital domain. They've been obviously slow to start. Startups are not known for the speed. I don't think anybody is going to compliment them on their speed. But I think they're very steady, and they understand. They build a good customer experience in everything that they do. They are very thorough. They are very meticulous. They make sure that they have a good brand and a good reputation, and they understand the value of the brand. So therefore, I think they are quite optimistic about what they can create in the digital domain, and therefore they are creating a significant digital foray. And they felt we could be a good, which sort of naturally fits into that entire tapestry. But more importantly, we also have the experience in terms of really helping their team understand and how to navigate the digital ecosystem in India. And I think so. Therefore, it was a happy marriage in terms of what we can do. So we said, okay, we will. Therefore, instead of really going with the investors that we had sort of outlined, we work with the Tatas. And we also decided to do a rejig of some of our cap table. We said it's useful in our business with all the ever-changing laws to become an Indian company and become a largely, Indian-owned company, because foreign laws, the FDI laws, particularly in e-commerce, have been guided by a lot of turmoil, and some of it well thought of, some of it just on the spur of the moment. And you can see the press every day, whether it's Amazon, Flipkart, or anybody else. So therefore, we said this also helps us strategically, positions us in much stronger position and gives us far more latitude to do a lot of stuff that we want to do. And that's how this thing came about.
Excellent. So on that note, actually, we've run out of time now. Thank you, Vipul, for so candidly sharing your experiences and learnings in your entrepreneurial journey, which has nothing been, which has been nothing short of absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you very much.
You covered the entire spectrum from culture to strategy, from operations, marketing, financing, scaling up the business. And we've all learned so much from your insights. And I'm really thankful to you for taking out the time and for participating in this session. We wish you all the very best. I think there is a new exciting period which is starting for you and for your organization. So as you continue scaling up Big Basket and achieving even greater success in the coming years, thank you once again. And thank you to all the participants for attending and for your active participation. I'm sorry we could not take all the questions, but I think Vipul really covered all the questions which we could take very well. So thank you again. And
thank you very much. Thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity. Wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Vipul.
Well,